Since July 11, 2021, Cubans of all walks of life have bravely taken to the streets in an impressive show of force and civic virtue. I'd like to make a few observations about the historic nature of these events, the US response, and the response of the Cuban American community. Make no mistake, these demonstrations have been truly historic. They have been massive, widespread, organic, heartfelt, peaceful, and fearless. For more than 62 years, the Cuban regime has used fear as a weapon against its own people, as a way to crush their hopes and aspirations, and as a way to control every aspect of their lives. And what we're seeing is that the population is beginning to lose that fear. Some have been quick to blame the current health crisis, or the declining economy, or even the tightening of US policy towards Cuba as reasons for the uprising. That is simply not the case. These brave women and men are risking their lives, demanding one thing and one thing alone: libertad, freedom. They're not calling for more vaccines or more medicine or even more food. They want freedom, plain and simple. They want an end to totalitarian communist rule. And they have made that very clear. I think that any meaningful change to what's happening in Cuba has to come from within the island itself. So that is why it's so important for the citizenry to take this first step. But it's only the first step, the first of many. This is going to be a long process, a process that rightfully has begun already inside Cuba. But just because it has to begin in Cuba, it does not mean that there isn't a meaningful role for the international community and for other nations, including the United States. There is. And so I'd like to say a few words about the response of the US government so far. In my opinion, that response has been extraordinarily weak and disappointing. It clearly has not risen to the occasion, to the historic events taking place. There's so much that the US can do to play a constructive role. Let me offer a couple of brief examples. One thing the administration can do is to mobilize the vast resources of the federal government and the private sector and bring them together to immediately restore internet access to the island so that Cubans can communicate with one another and can continue to mobilize in demand of freedom. And also so that the rest of the world can see firsthand the nature of these peaceful protests and the brutality of the Cuban government's response to it. And the US government can do this right away. So a second thing the US government can do is to convene the international community. The administration has said repeatedly that the US needs to work with its partners, with its allies, through international organizations to get the job done. Well, get to it. Start working with other countries. Start putting pressure on the governments of Mexico and Canada and every government in the Western Hemisphere, in the European Union, and throughout the world, so that together they can help the people of Cuba. The US can put a spotlight on these issues and bring the international community together, and also send a very clear signal to countries like China, Russia, Iran, that any efforts to interfere in the affairs of Cuba and further destabilize the situation in Cuba will be met with severe consequences. And that is something that the US can do. And also, as it puts that spotlight to bring the international community, it can use it to bring different segments of American society with whom the administration has very good relations, such as the media, academia, the entertainment industry, segments that have traditionally romanticized and glamorize the Cuban Revolution, so that they can see firsthand exactly what is going on in Cuba. Because anybody around the world who cares about human rights needs to see what the government is doing. And that is something that the US government can help do right away. Now, let me say a word about a policy option that has been mentioned with increased frequency: a military intervention. That is a very serious thing, and something that would not be productive. A military intervention is a mechanism of last resort that should be considered only when every other policy option has been exhausted. And clearly that is not the case here. There's many things that the administration can do that has yet to do that would be much more productive. And even then, it should only be considered in those cases in which there's an imminent threat to American vital security interests. And we're not there yet. So talking about an intervention is not productive. That is exactly what the Cuban government wants us to be talking about because it will create further division in the island. So let's focus on those policy options that are feasible, that are productive, and that would allow us to all come together to bring about the change that we desired. A peaceful, democratic Cuba with free markets and where people have the ability to have control over their own lives. Now, let me say a word about the role of the Cuban-American community. As Cubans inside the island have taken to the streets, so have Cuban Americans and other allies taken to the streets in Miami, in other cities in Florida, throughout the United States, including in our nation's capital, and around the world. That is incredibly important because it shows their solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Cuba, and because it sends a very clear signal to them that they are not alone. It's also very important for the Cuban American community to continue to do this because it sends a very clear message to their elected officials that they're going to hold them accountable, that they are demanding specific, concrete actions, not empty rhetoric or more study groups to study the situation, but concrete actions that are forceful, but also thoughtful and strategic. We all want the same thing for Cuba: democracy, free markets, and a society where there can be justice for every Cuban. And today, we're one step closer to that goal. So let's continue to build on the momentum that has been created and go forward.